Hello, dear friends. How are you? And Shana Tova. I hope your New Year holiday was moving and meaningful. That if you watched High Holiday or Sukkot services here on JBS, that they added to your participation and enjoyment of the holiday. And I hope that each of you be inscribed and sealed for a wonderful year of health and good times with people you love in the coming new Jewish year. I'm Mark Golub. It's so good to be back with you again. As some of you may know, I went into the hospital for a rather routine procedure at the end of July, and unfortunately, somehow I picked up a serious infection during my stay in the hospital, and that put me back in the hospital for another week. And it's taken almost 2 months for me to regain my full strength and health. But happily, I am very well. I was able to lead my Chavurah in Zoom High Holiday services. In fact, a number of you joined us for Yom Kippur. And Tikva and Ellen and Adina, what a real joy that was for me. And an enormous thank you to those of you who sent me such lovely and loving emails and texts and cards wishing me a refuah shlema. Your words meant the world to me. And so we begin this new year together, and I hope every one of you is continuing to get through this most difficult COVID time, which has put a huge emotional strain on everyone, in addition to the economic burden it's placed on so many Americans. Of course, in parts of our country, the number of COVID deaths is way, way down. In New York State, for example, where there once were 800 deaths a day, the number is now down to 11. And we're learning more and more about the virus and what to do or not do, especially to wear masks and to social distance. And the demographics have become clearer. Children and young adults seem to be at very little risk of becoming seriously ill or of dying of the virus, while those above the age of 70 remain in the high-risk group, especially those with underlying conditions. And as I always say, basically everyone included in the 70-year-old group has an underlying condition of some kind. So continue to be vigilant and careful, protect yourself, and one day, perhaps sooner than later, this pandemic will no longer be life-threatening, and we'll be able to return to life together, Gam Yachad, which was my own theme for these high holidays, that one day in the not-too-distant future, our lives will once again be actively intertwined with the people we love, like the braids of a Shabbat challah. In the meantime, that aspiration will help carry us through these periods of separation, even isolation. And for any one of you who does feel isolated or lonely, I truly hope that JBS is of some comfort to you. We are with you. And personally, I am so happy to once again be with you on Gam Yachad together during COVID-19. Of course, we're not the only ones who must cope with this pandemic. While Israel initially had a very low infection and death rate, a second wave has created real hardships and some havoc for the state of Israel. And to bring us up to date on the situation in Israel, I'm so pleased to be joined, as always, by JBS's Senior Vice President and a former member of the Israeli Diplomatic Corps, Shahar Azani. Shahar, it is so good to see you. And how are you and your family doing?
Well, first of all, we missed you, Mark. I have missed this, and it's so great to be with you. And again, to be together with all of our viewers. And I just want to make a quick comment about your opening. You spoke about together and the notion of us being able to come together soon once this, pandemic moves on. And I just want to say how incredible it is for me to be with you and with our JBS audience, because it's more than just the two of us. There is a whole community with us now.
Yes.
And then you get the feedback from corners you least expected, where it was fabulous to hear this show or hear you about this or see that show. And it makes me very happy to be of use in those times and to be together, even though not physically, socially, and emotionally.
That is beautifully said, and you have done a fabulous job whenever you've been on camera talking to people in Israel and the United States, and I am very, very grateful. So, Shahar, it sounds like things are very difficult in Israel these days. I'd love you to give us some perspective on what's going on there.
So, yes, Mark, indeed, things are extremely difficult at the moment. There is chaos that ranges not only from the health situation, but also to the political, and it all comes together and becoming the perfect storm. So, first of all, let's touch on the health. The quarantine that took place in Israel in March and April earlier this year was successful, and Israel was able to emerge from it better than many other countries around the world.
Yes.
However, like the Prime Minister himself admitted and many other leaders in Israel, the return to normalcy has been somewhat, in an all too Israeli fashion, too quick and too intense. Measures were not taken seriously as far as mask wearing and avoiding these mass events that bring so many people together. And the results were visibly shown all over Israel, where you were talking about a daily number of corroborated sick people who were infected with COVID-19, numbering by the thousands. The percentage per day was up to a couple of weeks ago 13.1%, only now slowly decreasing. It created significant pressure on the Israeli health system, and things were going really badly.
By the way, talk a moment about the extent to which the Israeli health system either has or has not been able to keep up with the rate of those who are seriously infected and need hospital care.
All in all, the Israeli health system has been successful in providing the care that it should to the people who need it. However, we are standing at the threshold of the maximum capacity it's able to withstand. They're already talking about hospitals in the Jerusalem area and the north area to be full to capacity and beyond. You have COVID-19 sections of the hospital in the garages, the parking garages of hospitals, to allow for the capacity of sick people. So even though we have not reached our breaking point yet, and maybe hopefully never reach, we are straining the system significantly, and there has been a lot of criticism at the government for not taking advantage of the month that passed since April to now to bolster the health system, to provide equipment for the nurses and the doctors, to bring more staff on board, to create the right traction, the teams, the to track down the disease and the track of the disease. And that criticism has been leveled at this national unity government. Now, when you're looking into the mass gatherings of Israel, you're talking about, and it brings me back to the kingdoms of Judea and Israel. You're thinking about two gatherings. One is the prayers during the high holidays, the assembly of the ultra-Orthodox and others who are eager to go to shul, like many Jews who want to take part in the high holiday services, as you know very well. And on the other hand, the mass demonstrations against the Prime Minister, these have been very persistent by the thousands on a daily basis in front of the Prime Minister's residence. And the question was, are you able to prohibit or limit those demonstrations? Is this, the right of the demonstrators and the democracy? And what do you do with the prayers? And if you limit the prayers, shouldn't you limit the demonstrations? And that all became this political quagmire of a battle. All in all, you're talking about a situation where the public trust in the government has decreased significantly. The political partnership between blue and white and Likud is strained by the day, almost threatening to break, and we can elaborate more if you'd like. And the situation vis-a-vis the general public has been very bad because in the past couple of weeks, and even today, Mark, there have been cases where high-level politicians were not adhering to the quarantine. Yes. When the Minister of Social Equality, Gila Gamliel, member of the Likud party, posted on her Instagram, remember, these are the high holidays and we all have to keep the regulations and keep intimate and at home. And then it's discovered that she celebrated or went for Yom Kippur to her in-laws in the city of Tiberias, 150 kilometers from home, spent the holiday with them, and then went to shul. And the third element is she was diagnosed now with COVID. So she not only carried the disease, she spread it. This is more than the theater of the absurd. This is downright tragic.
But we have seen on JBS, the pictures of people marching in the street, very, very angry. Most of the anger I've seen seems to be directed at Netanyahu, as if he somehow is responsible. Now, he at the moment remains prime minister. But to what extent do you feel this problem goes beyond any individual? Is it, and we do have a unity government where one would wonder where everybody is in the government, including Benny Gantz, but not only Benny Gantz. There are ministers of health, and there are institutions in Israel that are meant to deal with this. To what extent do you feel, first of all, that I'm right, that most of the anger is directed at Netanyahu? And then to what extent do you feel that is fair?
Well, let's think about Netanyahu at this point in time in Israel. And here is the crux of the issue. The prime minister has to make decisions pertaining to mass gatherings in Israel. Some of these gatherings, some would say the majority of these gatherings, are the demonstrations against the prime minister. Yes. However, as prime minister, he needs to make decisions based on health considerations. And that has been always the question of the prime minister's ability to function as an effective prime minister in spite of the indictments against him, or the extent to which the perception of the public is that the decision the prime minister is making is not only based on health considerations, but also based on his desire to be done with these demonstrations. Yes. Now, it's not just a mere guess, because the COVID-19 czar in Israel, Professor Ronnie Gamzu, at the very outset of this new second quarantine, the first in the world, came out and said, or people close to him said, that he doesn't believe there should be a mass quarantine. He believes there should be a targeted quarantine of zones where you have seen an increase of COVID-19, but not the mass quarantine. You've had people close to the Ministry of Finance and others who claim that this is wreaking havoc on the Israeli economy. So here you have the Israeli public with this dilemma of, hey, why is he limiting this? Maybe he shouldn't. The health experts are claiming this, and the prime minister says, many a time in my career, and I've heard him saying it myself, I have gone against the advice of the experts, and I know what's best, and this is what I believe is best for the people of Israel. Now, you have to be a judge of that. And right now, the anger that's targeted towards him is focused on his desire to stop the demonstrations. However, when it comes to the negligence of taking care of COVID-19, I can assure you that members of Blue and White and Likud are receiving a hellfire from many parts of the Israeli public. It's creating a lot of pressure on the government. Some members of the Blue and White Party are threatening resignation to leave the government, one of whom, the Minister of Tourism, Asaf Zamir, already resigned a couple of days ago, who decided to, go and support Blue and White, but from the outside. He said, I cannot be part of this in clear conscience. So the prime minister is under a lot of stress. Naturally, he's not solely to blame for COVID-19, but the demonstrations go beyond the COVID issue. They go very deep to his functioning as prime minister and a politician under this cloud of indictments.
Mm-hmm. By the way, his legal problems aside, it sounds eerily like what we hear and see in the United States, vis-a-vis so many people are very angry at the President of the United States, Donald Trump, personally, and argue that he has not listened to his experts. It's interesting. At one point, we felt as if Israel was handling this so differently than America and so much better than America. And now, Shahar, as we hear you describe the situation, am I not correct? It could be you're describing America.
I actually think that when it comes to what's happening now in Israel, and you're absolutely correct, Mark, it's even worse. And when it comes to politics, it is eerily amazing to see how similar the situation is, even when it comes to the judicial system, Mark. Right now, the discussion here in the U.S. is a discussion about the Supreme Court and the desire of the Republicans to influence the courts for generations to come and to create a change within the American system, if not through the ballot box, then through the courts by appointing a replacement for the late RBG. And here in Israel, there is a similar battle that's taking place because Netanyahu supposedly seems to be fighting the courts, and he is trying to shape the courts and the judicial system because of what he's going through, claiming that the courts and the police is misbehaving and inappropriate, that needs to be reformed. I want to tell you something, Mark. There has been a mini earthquake in Israel a couple of days ago when 3 leading columnists who are completely identified with the right wing in Israel came out with op-eds claiming that under these circumstances, Netanyahu can no longer function as an effective prime minister, and therefore he needs to hand over the reins to somebody else and focus on his indictment so that a prime minister who can lead Israel will solely focus on the dire issues at hand, because like you said, Mark, things are very difficult and extremely, extremely chaotic. Immediately, of course, many of those who are completely identified with Netanyahu, called the Bibists, lashed out at these writers, claiming they're part of a conspiracy with the attorney general who are trying to push Netanyahu out through a coup and not through elections. But it only gives you a sense of the kind of chaos politically that comes hand in hand with COVID-19 mess that touches the legal world. And it's very much similar to what we're seeing in America, which makes me think like really humanity is one and the same. Because look at what kind of mess we're all in.
So, Shahar, what does this now mean for politics in Israel? Just focus on that for a moment. As COVID was emerging, Benjamin Netanyahu and Benny Gantz agreed to a unity government, avoiding a 4th election, where Netanyahu would remain prime minister for a specified number of years, and then he would step down, perhaps step out of government altogether, and Gantz would become prime minister. To what extent is that still the way people, Israelis, view the situation? You've already alluded to the fact that the prime minister is under indictment for 3 separate counts, including bribery and other counts as well. And the question was, you and I were discussing, where would that go before COVID hit? Where does that stand now? And to what extent do the Israeli people, you alluded to this, but talk to it more, have confidence or no confidence in the existing government? And by government, I don't simply mean Netanyahu, Gantz, and their cabinet. I mean in the Knesset as a whole.
Well, so first of all, when it comes to the current political situation, we are facing a forced marriage. Blue and white knows they got nowhere to go because they're really down on the public polls because of everything that's happening. Netanyahu is stuck as well. He is really in dire straits, and he is stuck between a rock and a very, very hard place. And that rock and hard place are blue and white on the one hand and Benny Gantz, who are his partners right now in the coalition. But then right outside, knocking at the gates, soaring in the polls, is his mortal enemy, also known as the ultimate nemesis of the Netanyahus, called Naftali Bennett. And Naftali Bennett is lashing at the prime minister at every interview and on every opportunity against his handling of COVID-19, the fact that he wouldn't listen to him because he was Naftali Bennett. He even published a book that says How to Beat a Pandemic by Naftali Bennett, and says that when he was Minister of Defense, the prime minister would not utilize the Minister of Defense to fight COVID because Naftali Bennett headed the Minister of Defense, and therefore he wouldn't have him get credit for taking care of the pandemic. So you're talking about a really difficult situation for Netanyahu. At the same time, I have to say, there was a hope, maybe naive, that Netanyahu would behave. Unfortunately, soon after the government was formed, he made a promise on March 21st. He said, no tricks, no shticks. Well, a lot of them came in, many tricks and many more shticks. And right now the shtick is the state of Israel does not have a budget. The government has not approved a budget. It didn't go to the Knesset. Why? There should be a budget. Right now, the state of Israel works on 1/12 of the budget that was a couple of years ago to function on a regular basis. Why isn't there a budget, Mark? Because the vote on a budget becomes a vote of no confidence if the budget does not pass, which means that it is Netanyahu's opportunity, once there is a discussion on the budget, to break the pact with Gantz and declare elections in Israel 3 months after the budget vote. Right now, the budget was supposed to be decided in August. In August, the government was this close to being toppled. There was a last-minute decision that this will be postponed by 120 days. That means that in this coming month of December, there must be a vote on the budget. And if the vote on the budget fails, the government of Israel is dispersed, and there will be another round of elections in March of 2021. Now, some say that that is Netanyahu's only station of exit, and otherwise he's going to go on track to the rotation with Benny Gantz, which he doesn't want to do. Now, at the same time, you said very correctly that there is another engine chugging away, and that is the legal engine. Netanyahu's trial is commencing. No politics, no shticks, no press releases or media attention is going to change the fact that this coming January, 3 times a week, Netanyahu's affairs will be decided and discussed at Jerusalem's district court. Now that puts Netanyahu on an entirely different timeline and on an entirely different trajectory. His hope is that coming the next round of elections, he'll be able to establish a coalition that will give him immunity. Now, is that going to happen? Very dubious, if you ask me. For even within the Likud party, there are those who are refusing to give that to Netanyahu. But this all creates this chaos in Israel. And you see a situation where blue and white continues to act almost as an opposition within the coalition government. And that is untenable.
I know how much you love Israel. And of course, I keep mentioning your service in the diplomatic corps. You were stationed in Africa, you were stationed in England, you were stationed in Los Angeles, then you came to New York, and now here you are with us. But when you talk, the amount of chaos and the amount of what sounds like political corruption, or even a lack of principle, from the point where, and we've seen it here in America too, but where you've seen people who are in power and they tell the average Israeli how to behave, but they don't behave that way themselves. Then you have this kind of breakdown of any kind of political system. And in some way, first of all, Israel is only human beings. And politicians everywhere have, certain traits which are not the loftiest. When you have a really principled politician, you're very lucky. But people who are listening to you right now on JBS, who care about Israel and have a certain vision of how Israel operates, in many ways, what you're describing is very, if not upsetting, and it probably is, it's very disappointing. And I wanted to know, Shahar, how you, in some way, assimilate what's happening in Israel, and what do you say about Israel in the midst of all of this chaos?
Well, again, Mark, you're absolutely correct. And I think the disappointment, you can hear it in my voice. Israel is indeed facing an unprecedented crisis. And in that capacity, I can say that in that respect, it's the fact that we are here speaking, and I'm no longer part of the diplomatic corps, allows me to speak this, about this more openly. And what's happening now in Israel is more distressing than just undermining the rule of law. What you're seeing, the images that come out of Israel of police forces clashing brutally, whether with ultra-Orthodox communities in Jerusalem, Bnei Brak, or Ashdod, whether the police dispersing the demonstration with a very, very tough hand, whether you see a prime minister who's coping with a very difficult situation, but it's not only his own, because in the public perception, there are many, many people within Israel who identify with the prime minister. And he's making every effort on his end to show that this is not just his problem, that these indictments have been specifically cooked in order to take down those communities in Israel that support him. And that worries me, because it takes me back to dark days where you had clashes within the Jewish people, and we promised ourselves that the third temple shall never fall. And I'm afraid that at this point in time, we are facing such a leadership crisis that we have rarely experienced in the young history of this newly reestablished state of Israel, that we must overcome. And you'd think that in times of great crisis, when we come together, famously Israelis come together, you see great division within Israel. And I sincerely hope that elements in our leadership will seize the moment and will be able to take Israel to the next level beyond these divisions, because this is, and especially at a time when we see incredible things around us, the agreements with the United Arab Emirates, the thoughts of agreements with other countries in the Arab world, the fragmentation of Lebanon. Suddenly Hezbollah is exposed naked to the world with all of its malintent, both internally and externally. It's such a moment of great opportunity and challenge, but somehow it seems that fate always brings both of them together.
I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the honest analysis you bring. I don't know anyone else who has the insight you do, who is speaking to the American Jewish community, and I am so proud that we have you on JBS. There's a lot still to talk about, so we'll continue this very shortly. But in the meantime, as always, I wish you and your family health. We'll talk every day, and we'll see each other on Zoom, and one day we'll be together again. But as always, I thank you so very, very much, Shahar.
Thank you, Mark, and to all of our wonderful JBS viewers. As we always say, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy, and take things seriously. Put that mask on. It's no laughing matter.
Thank you. The insights of Shahar Azani, who is always a wonderful font of information and perspective and a courageous voice in the Jewish community. So my friends, please keep in mind that if there's a mazel tov in your family, or a family member or friend whose name you'd like me to read for a Misha Berach, or if there's a yortzeit coming up and you have no synagogue setting in which the name would be read, please send me your simchas and your names. I'll be honored to read them on Gam Yachad here on JBS. Information should be mailed to JBS Community at jbstv.org. And if you'd like to be in touch with me, email me at rabbigolub@jbstv.org. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Stay safe and be well, my friends.